The words hit me like a slap across the face. That's not a mother, that's trash. Look at her. She doesn't even know which fork to use. 500 people heard it. My fiancé heard it. And he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable chuckle. He threw his head back and laughed like it was the funniest thing he had ever heard in his entire privileged life. I stood there frozen in my white wedding gown, surrounded by millionaires and politicians, watching my 68-year-old mother, the woman who raised me completely alone, who worked 3 jobs simultaneously so I could attend college, who went hungry so I could eat, being publicly humiliated by the very people I was about to legally bind myself to forever. My mother's eyes met mine across that crowded ballroom, filled with crystal chandeliers and champagne towers. She gave me a small shake of her head, a silent message that only a daughter could understand. Don't, sweetheart. Not for me. Not today. Let it go. But what my future in-laws didn't know, what my fiancé didn't know, what even I didn't fully comprehend, until that very night when everything unraveled, was that my quiet, humble mother had been keeping a secret for 35 years, a secret she had guarded more carefully than her own life, a secret worth $1.2 billion. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 51 years old, and this is the true story of the day I chose my mother over a millionaire's son, called off my wedding in front of 500 shocked guests, and discovered that absolutely everything I thought I knew about my life, my childhood, and the woman who raised me was built on a foundation I never knew existed. By the end of this story, you will understand why patience is the most powerful weapon a person can possess, why the people who underestimate you are handing you their greatest vulnerability, and why my mother waited 3.5 decades to reveal what she had been building in complete silence while the world dismissed her as nothing. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I grew up in Millbrook, Indiana, population 4,200, the kind of town where everyone knows your business, your grandfather's business, and what you had for dinner last Tuesday. It was the kind of place where secrets were impossible to keep, or so I thought. My father left when I was 4 years old. Just left. No note, no forwarding address, no child support payments. No explanation that a 4-year-old could understand. One morning he was sitting at the breakfast table eating scrambled eggs, and by that afternoon he had become a ghost. A man who simply evaporated from our lives as if he had never existed in the first place. My mother, Eleanor Mitchell, was 29 years old at the time, with nothing but a GED, absolutely no job experience to speak of, and a daughter who needed to eat 3 meals a day. She could have crumbled under that weight. She could have packed our bags and moved us in with relatives who would have reminded her daily of her failure. She could have accepted defeat and let poverty define the rest of our future. Instead, she got angry. Not the loud kind of angry that explodes and fades. Not the bitter kind of angry that poisons everything it touches. She got the quiet kind of angry, the kind that becomes fuel for something nobody sees coming. Within a single week of my father's disappearance, my mother had secured 3 separate jobs. Mornings at the Bluebird Diner, from 5 in the morning until noon. I would sit in a corner booth doing my homework while she poured coffee and memorized the regulars' orders down to the exact way they liked their eggs prepared. She never wrote anything down. She just remembered, because remembering meant better tips. And better tips meant I could have new shoes when the old ones wore through. Afternoons, she spent cleaning offices downtown, the bank where people with money conducted their important business, the real estate agency where families bought homes we could never afford, the law firm where men in expensive suits walked past her like she was part of the furniture, invisible and beneath acknowledgement. She scrubbed their toilets and emptied their trash cans, and never once complained about the way they looked through her as if she did not exist. And evenings? That's when something different happened. Mom had taught herself bookkeeping entirely from library books. Actual physical books with worn covers and yellowed pages. This was long before the internet made learning accessible to everyone. She would sit at our small kitchen table until well past midnight, glasses sliding down her nose, pencils scratching against paper, balancing accounts for local businesses that could not afford professional accountants. I still remember lying in bed listening to the scratch of that pencil, the way she would whisper numbers under her breath like prayers, the cold cup of coffee she would forget to drink because she was so focused on making the numbers align perfectly. Whenever I came downstairs for water, she would look up at me with tired eyes and say the same thing. "Sarah, money comes and goes. But what you learn, that's yours forever. Nobody can repossess an education." I believed her then. I believe her now. But what I did not know, what I would not discover for another 40 years, was that those late nights at the kitchen table were not just about balancing other people's books. My mother was building something during those midnight hours. Something massive. Something that would eventually shake the foundations of one of Cincinnati's wealthiest families. And she never said a single word about it to anyone, including me. I did exactly what Mom wanted me to do with my life. Scholarships earned through endless hours of studying. Part-time jobs that left me exhausted but employed. Student loans that would take decades to repay. Nothing was handed to me on a silver platter. Every single achievement came through effort and sacrifice, and I was proud of that. By the time I turned 45, I had built what I considered a respectable career in hospital administration in Cincinnati. Nothing glamorous or headline-worthy. Budgets and spreadsheets. Staffing schedules and supply chain logistics. Making sure the right medical supplies arrived in the right departments at the right times. Middle management. Comfortable. Invisible to anyone who was not directly affected by my work. And I was completely single. 3 relationships that had seemed promising but ultimately failed. 2 almost engagements that fell apart for reasons I still do not fully understand. By my mid-40s, I had made peace with the idea that perhaps marriage simply was not in the cards for someone like me. Mom never pushed me about it, never made me feel inadequate for not providing her with grandchildren. "The right person shows up when you stop looking," she would say during our Sunday dinners together. "Or they don't. Either way, you've got me." And I did have her. Every Sunday dinner, without exception. Every holiday celebrated in her small living room. Every crisis, whether significant or trivial, Mom was there with advice and support, and that quiet strength I had admired my entire life. Then I met Richard Hartwell, and everything I thought I knew about my future changed in ways I never anticipated. It was a hospital fundraiser in downtown Cincinnati. Black tie required. I was there because my department had organized the entire event. He was there because his family had donated the money for the new cardiac wing that bore their name in gold letters above the entrance. Richard Hartwell, 53 years old, silver hair that gave him a distinguished appearance, an easy smile that made everyone around him feel comfortable, and old money charm that seemed effortless because it was he had never known anything else. He found me hiding near the dessert table, clearly overwhelmed by the champagne and the small talk and the pressure of mingling with people whose annual bonuses exceeded my yearly salary. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he said, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of wine. "Is it that obvious?" I asked, embarrassed at being caught. "Only to someone who feels the same way." We talked for 3 hours that night, while the gala continued around us. He was funny without being cruel, self-deprecating without fishing for compliments, and seemingly uninterested in the wealth surrounding us, despite being one of its primary sources. He asked about my work and actually listened to the answers. He asked about my life and remembered the details. He asked about my mother and wanted to know what kind of woman had raised me alone. By our 3rd date, I was falling. By our 6th month together, I was completely gone. Richard proposed on a Tuesday evening, not at some fancy restaurant or exotic vacation destination, but in my mother's small living room in Millbrook, Indiana. He got down on one knee in front of the woman who had raised me and asked for her blessing before he asked for my hand. "The ring probably cost more than her entire house was worth. I want your mother to be the first to know," he said. "Family matters to me." I should have noticed that his family was not there for this moment. I should have asked why his parents, his siblings, his entire world was conspicuously absent from the most important question of his life. But I was too happy to notice the warning signs, too in love to ask the questions that might have saved me years of pain. The Hartwells' reaction to our engagement would teach me everything I needed to know about the world I was marrying into. I just was not paying attention. The Hartwell estate sat on 40 acres of meticulously maintained land outside Cincinnati, a property so vast that you could fit the entire town of Millbrook inside its boundaries and still have room left over for a golf course. Iron gates that required a security code to open. A circular driveway made of imported Italian stone. A house that looked more like a museum than a place where actual human beings lived their daily lives. The first time Richard drove me through those gates, I felt my stomach tighten with a sensation I could not quite name at the time. Now I recognize it for what it was, my instincts trying to warn me that I was entering a world that would never accept someone like me, no matter how hard I tried to belong. Richard's father, William Hartwell, was 76 years old and had spent 5 decades building the family fortune in pharmaceutical distribution. Not inventing medicine that saved lives. Not researching cures for diseases that plagued humanity. Distributing. He was essentially a very wealthy middleman who had positioned himself between manufacturers and hospitals, taking a percentage of every transaction while contributing nothing of actual value to the healthcare system. But he believed himself to be a captain of industry, a titan of commerce, a self-made man, despite having inherited his initial capital from his own father. His wife, Caroline, was his second marriage, 20 years younger than William, surgically preserved to maintain an appearance of agelessness, and entirely devoted to maintaining what she called the Hartwell standard. That standard, I would learn through painful experience over the following months, had very specific requirements about who belonged in their world of charity, galas, and country club memberships, and summer homes in the Hamptons. It also had very specific requirements about who did not belong, who would never belong, who should know their place and stay in it without complaint. The first dinner at the Hartwell estate was instructive in ways I did not fully appreciate until much later. Mom came with me because I insisted she be there. I wanted the 2 most important people in my life to meet each other, to connect, to begin building the family that I had always dreamed of having. She wore her best dress, a navy blue ensemble she had purchased for my college graduation ceremony and had carefully preserved in her closet for 15 years, bringing it out only for the most special occasions. I thought she looked beautiful that evening. Elegant in her simplicity. Dignified in a way that required no designer labels or precious gemstones to achieve. Caroline Hartwell saw something entirely different when she looked at my mother. I watched her eyes travel deliberately from Mom's sensible flat shoes to her drugstore pearl necklace to the small clutch purse that did not match whatever arbitrary fashion the current season demanded. Her gaze was clinical, evaluating, dismissive the way someone might examine a stain on an otherwise acceptable tablecloth. "How charming," Caroline said when we were introduced, and the word dripped with so much condescension that it practically left puddles on the marble floor. "Richard mentioned your mother was self-sufficient." Self-sufficient, a polite way of saying poor. A socially acceptable method of acknowledging that my mother worked for a living while simultaneously making clear that working for a living was something the Hartwells considered beneath their station. Mom just smiled with the same warmth she showed to everyone she met, regardless of their bank account balance or social standing. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Hartwell. Thank you for having us in your beautiful home." But I saw Caroline's face tighten almost imperceptibly at my mother's response. Something in her expression shifted, hardened, calculated. My mother had not cowered before her, had not apologized for existing in the same space as the Hartwell family, had not played the role of grateful supplicant that Caroline had clearly expected her to perform. That refusal to be diminished, I would learn, was absolutely unforgivable in Caroline's world. Over the next 8 months, the small cruelties accumulated like drops of poison falling into a well, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but collectively contaminating everything they touched. The dress shopping incident occurred 6 months before the wedding was scheduled to take place. Caroline organized a bridal party outing to an exclusive boutique downtown bridesmaids, her society friends, a champagne-fueled afternoon of trying on designer gowns that cost more than most people earned in a year. My mother was not invited. When I confronted Caroline about the obvious exclusion, she did not even have the decency to appear embarrassed. "We didn't want to overwhelm her," Caroline explained, with that thin smile that never reached her eyes. "Those shops can be so intimidating for people who aren't accustomed to that environment. We thought she would be more comfortable at home. I should have pushed back harder than I did. I should have demanded that my mother be included in every aspect of my wedding planning. But Richard said his mother meant well, that she was just trying to be considerate, that I was reading too much into a simple oversight. I wanted to believe him because believing him was easier than confronting the truth that was staring me directly in the face. The country club lunch happened 3 months before the wedding date. Caroline hosted what she called a welcome to the family luncheon at the Hartwell Country Club, a venue so exclusive that membership was by invitation only and waiting lists stretched across generations. Mom arrived in a lovely spring dress that she had made herself using a pattern from a sewing magazine and fabric she had purchased on sale at the local craft store. She was an excellent seamstress, another skill she had taught herself entirely from library books during those long nights when she should have been sleeping. I thought she looked wonderful, put together, appropriate for the occasion. Then I overheard Caroline whispering to her circle of society friends at a nearby table. She made the dress herself. Can you imagine? I didn't know people still did that sort of thing. It's almost quaint, isn't it? Like watching someone churn their own butter or darn their own socks. The laughter that followed that observation carried across the entire dining room, loud enough that my mother must have heard every word and every cruel chuckle that accompanied them. But Mom pretended not to notice. She complimented the garden visible through the windows. She asked the waitstaff about their families and whether they were having a good day. She made genuine conversation with the one other guest who seemed uncomfortable in that room full of privilege and judgment. She never said a single word about what she had heard, never acknowledged the cruelty that had been directed at her in front of dozens of witnesses. But I knew what had happened, and it burned inside me like acid. The seating chart humiliation occurred 1 month before the wedding was scheduled to take place. We gathered in Caroline's sitting room to review the reception arrangements, including where each of the 500 invited guests would be seated during dinner. When I looked for my mother's name on the elaborate chart that Caroline had prepared, I found her assigned to table 47, the farthest possible distance from the head table where Richard and I would be seated, positioned near the kitchen entrance, grouped with the Hartwell family's accountant, 2 distant cousins whom no one in the family actually spoke to, and the caterer's assistant, who was only attending because she happened to be dating one of Richard's groomsmen. She'll be more comfortable with her own kind, Caroline explained when I demanded to know why my mother had been banished to the most undesirable location in the entire venue, her own kind. The words hung in the air between us like a declaration of war. I moved Mom to table 2, directly beside the head table where she belonged. Caroline moved her back to table 47. We went back and forth 3 separate times, fighting over a seating chart like children arguing over toys, before Richard finally intervened in the dispute. "Just let Mother handle it," he said to me, in a tone that suggested I was being unreasonable. "She knows these things. She understands how these events are supposed to work." That should have been my warning, a flashing red sign that I was too blind or too desperate to read correctly. The man I loved had just called his mother, Mother, with a capital M, had just told me to surrender my mother's dignity to Caroline's control, had just made clear whose family would always come first in our marriage. I should have run as far and as fast as my legs could carry me. I did not run. I stayed because I still believed that love could bridge the gap between our worlds. I was wrong, but the worst was yet to come. What happened at the rehearsal dinner would haunt me for months afterward, replaying in my memory like a nightmare I could not escape, and it would change absolutely everything about my life, my family, and my understanding of who my mother truly was. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Pemberton, one of Cincinnati's oldest and most exclusive restaurants, a establishment where reservations required connections, and the wine list contained bottles that cost more than my monthly salary. Caroline had reserved the private dining room for the occasion, 200 guests, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across every surface, candlelight flickering on tables draped in Irish linen, a champagne fountain that cost more than my mother earned in a month of working at the Bluebird Diner. It was a display of wealth so excessive that it felt almost aggressive, as if the Hartwells wanted to make absolutely certain that everyone present understood the difference between their world and the world that I had come from. Mom arrived early, as she always did for important events. Punctuality was something she had drilled into me. From childhood, being late was disrespectful to other people's time, and Eleanor Mitchell never disrespected anyone if she could help it. She was dressed beautifully that evening in a forest green dress that I had helped her select during a shopping trip the previous month. She wore her late mother's cameo brooch, pinned carefully at her collar, simple gold earrings that my father had given her before he disappeared and became a ghost in our lives. She looked nervous standing in that opulent room filled with people whose shoes cost more than her car. She had never been comfortable around wealth, around people who measured worth in bank balances and stock portfolios. But she was there for me, smiling bravely despite her discomfort, determined not to cause any trouble that might reflect poorly on her daughter. I was swept away within minutes of arriving at the dinner. Endless introductions to people whose names I would never remember. Richard's business partners evaluating me with calculating eyes. Caroline's society friends, examining my dress and jewelry and posture, searching for flaws they could discuss later over cocktails. Everyone evaluating me like merchandise on display, assessing whether I was worthy of joining their exclusive club. I played my role as best I could, smiling until my face ached, making small talk about subjects I cared nothing about, pretending to be comfortable in a world that felt as foreign to me as another planet. When I finally extracted myself from a conversation about someone's yacht renovation and looked around the room to find my mother, she was nowhere in sight. I scanned the crowd of 200 guests, searching for her forest green dress, her silver hair, her familiar face. My heart began to beat faster as the seconds passed without locating her. Then I spotted her, and my blood went cold. She was standing near the service entrance that led to the kitchen, holding a silver tray loaded with champagne glasses. Someone had tied a server's apron around her waist, hastily knotted as if she had been grabbed and costumed without warning. Her face showed confusion but also determination. She was gamely trying to serve drinks to passing guests who accepted the champagne without looking at her face, without recognizing her as the mother of the bride. Caroline stood nearby with her circle of friends, gesturing toward my mother as if pointing out an interesting exhibit at a zoo. I just asked if she could help out, since she was hovering so awkwardly by herself, Caroline was saying in a voice loud enough to carry across the room. I thought she would be more comfortable working. That is what she does, isn't it? Cleaning other people's houses? Serving food at that little diner? This is really more her natural environment. She looked positively lost, standing among civilized people. The laughter that followed was explosive, overwhelming, a wave of cruel amusement that swept through the room like wildfire. 200 people heard what Caroline said. 200 people laughed at my 68-year-old mother being humiliated in front of everyone she would have called family after the wedding. I pushed through the crowd, with my heart pounding against my ribs, my vision narrowing until all I could see was that single scene. My mother holding a tray of champagne, wearing an apron someone had forced upon her, surrounded by wealthy strangers who found her existence amusing. But before I could reach her, before I could remove that apron and that tray and demand that Caroline apologize, Richard's younger brother stepped forward from the crowd. Bradley Hartwell was 28 years old, the beneficiary of a trust fund that guaranteed he would never need to work a single day in his pampered life, a young man whose greatest accomplishment was being born into the right family. That's not a mother, Bradley announced loudly, champagne sloshing in his glass as he gestured dramatically toward my mother for the entertainment of the crowd. That's trash. Look at her standing there like a lost puppy. She doesn't even know which fork to use at a proper dinner table. Someone should take her back to whatever trailer park she crawled out of before she embarrasses everyone with her presence. The room erupted in laughter even louder than before. People who had never met my mother, who knew nothing about her sacrifices or her strength or her decades of working 3 jobs to give me a better life, laughed at her as if Bradley had delivered the cleverest joke they had ever heard. And Richard, my Richard, the man who had proposed in my mother's living room, the man who had said that family mattered to him, the man I had believed loved me despite our different backgrounds, laughed with them. Not an uncomfortable laugh that might have indicated he recognized how wrong this was. Not a nervous laugh that suggested he wanted to stop the cruelty but did not know how. He threw his head back and laughed genuinely, heartily, as if watching my mother be publicly destroyed was the funniest thing he had ever witnessed in his entire privileged existence. Mom set down the tray of champagne glasses on a nearby table, carefully, deliberately. With the same precision she brought to everything she did. She untied the apron from around her waist and folded it neatly, placing it on the table beside the tray as if she were finishing a shift at the diner and preparing to go home. Then she looked at me across that crowded room filled with laughing faces and champagne and cruelty. Her eyes were red, but she was not crying. There was something else in her expression, something I had never seen before in all my years of knowing this woman who had raised me alone. It was not sadness or humiliation or defeat. It was something harder, something colder, something that suggested depths I had never suspected existed beneath her gentle surface. She gave me the smallest shake of her head, a gesture so subtle that no one else in that room would have noticed it. A silent message from mother to daughter. Don't, sweetheart. Not for me. It's not worth it. Let it go. But she was wrong about that. She was worth everything. She was worth more than Richard Hartwell and his family's fortune. She was worth more than this wedding and these 500 guests and the $200,000 in deposits that would be forfeited. She was worth more than any future I might have imagined, with a man who could laugh while his brother called my mother trash. I walked to the center of the room with a calm that surprised even me. The laughter died slowly as people began to notice the bride to be standing there in her rehearsal dinner dress, face pale with a fury that radiated from every pore of my being. The room fell silent in stages, conversations stopping one by one as guests turned to see what was happening. I stood there in that silence, surrounded by 200 faces, staring at me with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance to the barest flicker of genuine sympathy. "Richard," I said in a voice loud enough for everyone in that room to hear clearly, "did you just laugh at your future mother-in-law being called trash by your brother?" The silence that followed my question was absolute. No clinking glasses, no whispered conversations, no nervous shuffling, just 200 people holding their breath to see what would happen next. Richard's smile faltered, the amusement draining from his face, as he realized this moment was not going to pass without consequence. "Sarah, come on!" Bradley was just joking around. "You know how he is. Don't make this into something bigger than it needs to be." "A scene?" I asked, feeling something crystallize inside me with each word I spoke. "Is that what you're worried about? Making a scene in front of your important guests?" I looked around the room at 200 faces staring at me, some confused about what was happening, some annoyed that their evening was being disrupted, some very few but some actually sympathetic to what I was experiencing. And in that moment of clarity, I realized something I had been avoiding for months, something I had refused to acknowledge because acknowledging it meant abandoning the future I had planned and the love I thought I had found. These were not my people. This was not my world, and the man I had believed loved me despite our different backgrounds was exactly like them, a person who measured worth in dollars and pedigree rather than character and sacrifice. He had watched his family mock me and my mother for 8 months and had done nothing to stop it. He had told me to let his mother make decisions about where my mother would sit at my own wedding. He had laughed when his brother called the woman who raised me trash. Richard Hartwell was not the man I thought he was, and he never had been. I had simply been too desperate to believe in the fairy tale to see the truth standing right in front of me. "The wedding is off," I said, not shouted, not screamed, just stated as a simple fact, as if I were announcing that the sky was blue or that water was wet. The room exploded into chaos, gasps and exclamations, and the scraping of chairs as people rose to their feet. Caroline's face went white, then red. William started shouting about deposits and embarrassment. Bradley muttered something about how I was proving I did not belong in their family anyway. Richard pushed through the crowd toward me with his hands raised as if to calm a frightened animal. "Sarah, be reasonable. Let's go somewhere private and talk about this. You're upset, but we can work through it." I did not respond to him. Instead, I walked directly to my mother, took her hand in mine, and led her toward the exit. We walked out of that restaurant together, mother and daughter, leaving behind $200,000 in non-refundable deposits, 500 guests who would arrive at a venue tomorrow expecting a wedding that would never take place, and a man I had genuinely believed would be my partner for the rest of my life. I left behind the dream of finally belonging somewhere, of having the family I had always wanted, of building a future with someone who loved me for who I was rather than despite where I came from. And I did not look back. Not once. The cool night air hit my face as we stepped outside, and I realized I was shaking not from cold, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins, from the magnitude of what I had just done, from the uncertainty of what would come next. Mom squeezed my hand as we walked toward my car, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of 68 years. She did not say anything. She did not need to. We had always understood each other without words. I had no idea, as I drove away from the Pemberton that night, leaving the Hartwell family and their world behind forever, that the biggest shock of my life was still coming. It was not the canceled wedding. It was not the $200,000 I had just forfeited. It was not even the realization that I had wasted years of my life on a man who did not deserve my love. The biggest shock was waiting in my mother's small kitchen in Millbrook, Indiana, in a locked cabinet that I had never been allowed to open, containing secrets that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about my life and the woman who had raised me. We drove to Mom's house in complete silence, the headlights cutting through the darkness of the Indiana night as familiar roads passed beneath the wheels of my car. The same small two-bedroom home she had lived in for 40 years appeared ahead of us, its porch light glowing like a beacon, calling us back to safety. The same kitchen table where she had balanced those ledgers at midnight was waiting inside, the same worn furniture and modest decorations that I had known my entire life. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel from a combination of adrenaline and rage and relief and 100 other emotions I could not identify or name. The magnitude of what I had just done was beginning to settle over me like a heavy blanket. I had canceled my wedding in front of 200 witnesses. I had walked away from Richard Hartwell and his family's fortune. I had forfeited $200,000 in deposits that represented years of savings. And somehow, despite all of that loss, I felt lighter than I had in months. "Mom, I'm sorry," I finally said as we pulled onto her quiet street. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have recognized what kind of people they were before it ever got this far. I should have protected you better." She placed her hand on mine, where it gripped the steering wheel, her touch warm and steady and reassuring in the way that only a mother's touch can be. "Sarah, you have nothing to apologize for. Not one single thing. You just gave up everything you thought you wanted in order to defend me. Do you understand how rare that is? How many people would have stayed silent to protect their own interests?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak without crying. "They treated you like garbage," I managed to say, "in front of everyone. They made you serve champagne at your own daughter's rehearsal dinner and then laughed when Bradley called you trash." "They did," Mom agreed, and there was no argument in her voice, no attempt to minimize what had happened. "They absolutely did treat me that way." She paused for a moment, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice I had never heard before. Not anger, which I would have expected and understood, something colder than anger, something more calculated and deliberate. "And now they're going to learn what a very expensive mistake that was." I glanced at her in the darkness of the car, trying to read her expression in the intermittent light from passing street lamps. "Mom? What are you talking about? What do you mean by expensive mistake?" She smiled that same small, knowing smile I had seen at the rehearsal dinner when she looked at Caroline Hartwell with something that resembled pity rather than humiliation. At the time, I had not understood that expression. Now I felt the first stirring of realization that my mother was not the simple, humble woman I had always believed her to be. "Pull into the driveway, sweetheart. Park the car and come inside with me. There's something I need to show you. Something I should have revealed a long time ago but couldn't. Not until you were ready. Not until the moment was right." I did as she asked, my mind racing with possibilities that made no logical sense given everything I knew about my mother's life. We walked into the house together, and she led me directly to the kitchen where so many important conversations of my life had taken place. In the corner of Mom's kitchen stood an old oak cabinet that had been there for as long as I could remember. It had always been locked, the brass keyhole dark and mysterious throughout my childhood. Whenever I asked about it as a little girl, curious about what secrets it might contain, Mom would give me the same answer every time. Important papers, sweetheart. Boring stuff. Nothing interesting. Tax documents and insurance policies and things that would put you straight to sleep. I stopped asking eventually, accepting her explanation the way children accept most things their parents tell them, filing it away as just another unremarkable detail of our unremarkable life. Now, Mom reached up to her neck and pulled out a small key on a thin chain that I had never noticed before, despite 51 years of knowing this woman intimately. She inserted the key into the lock, turned it with a click that seemed to echo through the quiet kitchen, and opened the cabinet doors for the first time in my presence. Inside were stacks of documents I did not recognize. Folders with labels written in careful handwriting. Legal papers with official seals and signatures. Things that did not belong in a modest kitchen in Millbrook, Indiana. Things that suggested a life entirely different from the one I thought my mother had lived. She pulled out a thick leather portfolio, the kind that lawyers and executives carry to important meetings, and set it on the kitchen table between us. The leather was expensive, well-maintained, clearly something that had been handled with care over many years. "Sit down, Sarah," she said, in a voice that carried a weight I was only beginning to understand. "This is going to take a while, and you need to be sitting when you hear what I'm about to tell you." I sat in the chair I had occupied thousands of times before, for Sunday dinners and holiday meals and late-night conversations about heartbreak and hope. But this conversation would be different from all of those. This conversation would change everything. Mom opened the portfolio and turned it so I could see the first page. It was a stock certificate, an official document covered in numbers and percentages and corporate names I did not recognize. My eyes scanned the page without understanding what I was looking at, the information refusing to assemble itself into anything coherent. Then I saw the value printed at the bottom of the document, and I stopped breathing. $147 million. The number sat there on the page, impossible and undeniable. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely functioning. "What is this? What am I looking at?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned the page to reveal another document. Real estate holdings. A beach house in Florida worth $3 million. An apartment building in Columbus generating $600,000 in annual rental income. Commercial property in Chicago. A shopping center in Texas. Page after page after page. Investment accounts with balances that made my head spin. Business partnerships with companies I had never heard of. Trust funds that had been growing for decades. Each page revealed another piece of a fortune I never knew existed, a secret life my mother had been living in parallel to the modest existence I thought was our reality. "The total," Mom said quietly when she reached the final page of the portfolio, "is currently valued at approximately $1.2 billion, give or take a few million depending on market fluctuations." The room seemed to tilt around me. My vision blurred. I could not speak, could not form thoughts coherent enough to become words. My mother, the woman who cleaned offices for minimum wage, who served coffee at the Bluebird Diner for tips, who made her own dresses from fabric store patterns because she said designer clothes were a waste of money, was a billionaire. "Mom? How?" I finally managed to ask, my voice cracking with the effort. "How is this possible? How can you have $1 billion when we lived in this tiny house my entire life? When you worked 3 jobs? When we clipped coupons and bought clothes from thrift stores?" She poured 2 cups of tea from the kettle that was always warm on her stove, her solution to every crisis and every celebration since I was old enough to remember. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, wrapping her hands around her cup, and began to tell me a story I had never heard before. "Do you remember the bookkeeping, Sarah? All those late nights when you would come downstairs for water and find me sitting at this very table, pencil in hand, working on someone's accounts?" I nodded, the memories vivid despite the decades that had passed. I wasn't just balancing accounts for local businesses. Or rather, I was. But that was only part of what I was doing. I was learning, studying, teaching myself how money actually works, how investments grow, how wealth is created and preserved across generations. She took a sip of her tea, gathering her thoughts. 35 years ago, one of my bookkeeping clients was a man named Harold Weston. He owned a small medical supply company operating out of a warehouse on the edge of town. Just 15 employees, barely enough revenue to keep the lights on, perpetually on the verge of bankruptcy. Harold was brilliant when it came to medicine and engineering, but he was absolutely terrible with money. His books were a complete disaster when I first saw them. It took me 6 months of working nights and weekends to untangle the mess he had created. She smiled at the memory, something warm in her expression, despite the difficult circumstances she was describing. During those 6 months of sorting through his finances, I saw something that no one else had noticed. The company had a patent, a new type of surgical instrument that Harold had invented almost by accident while trying to solve a problem for a local surgeon. He didn't realize the significance of what he had created. Nobody did. But I saw the potential because I had spent years studying markets and innovations and what makes certain products succeed while others fail. Harold couldn't afford to pay me for my bookkeeping work. He was apologetic about it, embarrassed, offering to pay me whenever his ship came in. Instead of demanding cash, I proposed a different arrangement. I asked him for 5% ownership in the company in exchange for the months of work I had already completed. Everyone thought I was crazy when they heard about the deal. 5% of a failing medical supply company run by a man who couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life? It seemed absolutely worthless. A terrible trade for months of labor I could have spent earning actual money at the diner or cleaning offices. She set down her teacup and looked at me with those eyes that I now realized had been hiding depths I never suspected. I took the deal anyway. I had a feeling about Harold and his invention. I can't explain it logically. Something told me he was on to something important, something that could change the industry if he could just keep his company alive long enough for the world to notice. 10 years later, Mom explained, that surgical instrument became the industry standard. Hospitals across the country adopted Harold's invention because it was simply better than anything else available. The major medical corporations took notice of the small company in Indiana that held the patent everyone needed. A bidding war erupted between 3 of the largest medical supply companies in the world, each desperate to acquire Harold's business before their competitors could. When the dust settled, Harold sold his company for $240 million. Mom's 5% ownership stake was suddenly worth $12 million. I could have stopped there, she said. $12 million is more than enough for anyone to live comfortably for the rest of their life. I could have bought a mansion, traveled the world, never worked another day. But that wasn't what I wanted. Instead of spending her windfall, Mom reinvested almost all of it. She studied the market obsessively, reading financial publications and attending investor conferences under her own name without anyone connecting her to the fortune she was building. She made connections with other entrepreneurs, other inventors, other brilliant people whose ideas needed capital and support. She found other Harold Westons scattered across the country, people with revolutionary concepts who just needed someone to believe in them and provide the resources to make their visions reality. I never gambled with the money, she explained. I never speculated on trends or tried to time the market like a day trader. I found people I trusted and bet on their character. That's something the Hartwells will never understand, Sarah. Money isn't really about numbers on a page or algorithms in a computer. It's about people. It's about recognizing potential in someone that others have overlooked. It's about having the patience to wait years or even decades for an investment to mature. Over 35 years, those investments grew beyond anything Mom had initially imagined. $12 million became $50 million. $50 million became $200 million. By the time the technology boom arrived, Mom's portfolio had grown to $500 million. She invested early in companies that would become household names, not because she understood the technology, but because she understood the people building it. Today, her total net worth stood at $1.2 billion, a fortune built entirely through patience and insight and an uncanny ability to see value where others saw only risk. And she had kept every single penny of it secret, even from me. Why? I asked, tears streaming down my face as the enormity of what she had hidden began to sink in. Why did you keep this from me for my entire life? We could have had everything. You didn't have to work 3 jobs until your body ached. You didn't have to serve coffee to people who treated you like you were invisible. You didn't have to make your own dresses or clip coupons or drive that ancient car until it fell apart. Why would you live like that when you could have had anything in the world? Mom reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm and warm. Sarah, we did have everything. We had each other. We had Sunday dinners where we actually talked about our lives. We had Christmas mornings that were about love, not about expensive gifts neither of us needed. We had real conversations about real things that actually mattered. Money like this destroys people. I've watched it happen over and over throughout my years of investing. She squeezed my hand tighter, willing me to understand. Families torn apart by inheritance disputes. Children ruined by entitlement, never developing any character because they never had to struggle for anything. Relationships poisoned by greed when someone suspects their partner only loves them for their wealth. I've seen every possible way that money can corrupt and destroy the people it touches. I wanted you to build your own life. I wanted you to earn your own success through your own effort and develop your own character through your own struggles. I wanted you to become the person you are because of who you are inside, not because of what I had in a bank account. If you had known about this money while you were growing up, it would have changed you. You might have become entitled, like Bradley Hartwell. You might have measured people by their net worth, like Caroline. You might have lost the kindness and empathy that make you who you are. I couldn't risk that. I couldn't risk losing my daughter to a pile of money. She paused, and that cold calculation returned to her eyes. But now those people need to learn something very important about underestimating others. They looked at me and saw a poor old woman in a homemade dress, someone to mock and humiliate for their entertainment. They were so certain of their own superiority that they never considered I might be more than I appeared. And you, sweetheart, are going to help me teach them exactly how costly that mistake is going to be. What my mother had planned for the Hartwells was not revenge in the petty sense of the word. It was justice. It was a reckoning 35 years in the making, and by the time it was finished, the Hartwell family would understand that the quiet woman they had dismissed as trash was more powerful than all of them combined. The morning after the canceled wedding, Mom made a phone call, not to apologize for the scene at the Pemberton, not to reconcile with the Hartwell family or smooth over the embarrassment. To activate. I sat at the kitchen table nursing cold coffee while she dialed a number from memory, her voice shifting into something I had never heard before. Crisp, professional, commanding. Jonathan, it's Eleanor. Yes, it's time. Start the due diligence immediately. I want a full report on my desk within 72 hours. Jonathan Turner, I would learn, was a corporate attorney based in Chicago who specialized in hostile acquisitions and corporate restructuring. He had been working with my mother for 8 years, managing various aspects of her investment portfolio and providing legal counsel on matters I never knew existed. I had never heard his name before that morning. I had never suspected that my mother had attorneys and accountants and financial advisors on retainer across the country. The Hartwells have been on my radar since Richard first brought you home, Mom explained after ending the call. I don't trust easily, Sarah. I never have. And I certainly don't trust old money families who look down on working people as if their bank accounts make them morally superior. She had been researching them for months, quietly gathering information while I was busy planning a wedding that would never happen. Every dinner at the Hartwell estate, every lunch at the country club, every interaction with Caroline and William had been an opportunity for Mom to observe and assess. She noticed things I had been too blinded by love to see. The way William checked his phone obsessively during meals, the stress lines around his eyes when business was mentioned, the subtle tension between him and his accountant at the engagement party. Hartwell Pharmaceutical Distribution was the family's primary asset, the source of their wealth and social standing. William had built it from a modest regional operation into a national company worth approximately $400 million on paper. But Mom had found cracks in the foundation that the Hartwells had worked very hard to conceal from the world. They're leveraged to the absolute hilt, she explained, spreading financial documents across the kitchen table. Documents I had no idea how she had obtained. William has been borrowing against the company for years to fund his lifestyle. That 40-acre estate, mortgaged 3 times over. The yacht they keep at the marina? Leased, not owned. Caroline's famous jewelry collection that she shows off at every charity gala? Half of it is paste. The originals were sold years ago to cover debts. The Hartwells were not nearly as wealthy as they pretended to be. Their entire existence was smoke and mirrors, reputation and credit lines, a carefully constructed facade designed to maintain their position in society while the foundation crumbled beneath them. They were vulnerable in ways they had worked desperately to hide from everyone, including their own son. "What are you going to do?" I asked, still struggling to reconcile the mother I thought I knew with the billionaire strategist sitting across from me. Mom smiled with that cold calculation I was beginning to recognize. "I'm going to buy them, every single piece of their empire. And then I'm going to dismantle it while they watch." Over the next 2 weeks, Mom's team began quietly acquiring Hartwell pharmaceutical distribution stock through a network of anonymous holding companies and strategic purchases designed to avoid triggering any suspicion or regulatory alerts. Each transaction was small enough to fly under the radar, but collectively they represented a systematic takeover that William Hartwell never saw coming. Meanwhile, Mom's forensic accountants, a team of specialists she had used for years to evaluate potential investments, dug deeper into the company's finances than any outside party had ever been allowed to go. What they found was far worse than mismanagement or poor business decisions. William Hartwell had been systematically defrauding his own company for over a decade, siphoning money through elaborate schemes designed to enrich himself at the expense of shareholders and employees. Fake consulting fees paid to shell companies he secretly controlled, personal expenses charged to corporate accounts, vacations disguised as business trips, home renovations billed as office improvements, even Caroline's clothing allowance hidden in the marketing budget. Payments to employees who did not exist, their salaries deposited directly into accounts William had access to. The evidence was documented, verified by multiple independent sources, and absolutely devastating. "We could go to the authorities right now," Jonathan said during a conference call that I was allowed to observe. "This is more than enough for criminal charges. Securities fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. William Hartwell could spend the rest of his life in prison." Mom shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "Not yet. The authorities will be contacted when the time is right. But first, they need to understand exactly who they mocked at that rehearsal dinner. They need to see my face when their world collapses." While Mom methodically built her case, the Hartwells' social universe was already beginning to crumble from the inside out. The story of the canceled wedding spread through Cincinnati's elite circles faster than wildfire, passed from one society matron to another at charity luncheons and country club gatherings. But it was not the version of events that the Hartwells had expected or hoped would circulate. The guests who had witnessed the rehearsal dinner started talking about what they had actually seen. The champagne tray forced into an elderly woman's hands, Bradley's loud declaration that my mother was trash, Richard's genuine laughter at the humiliation of the woman who would have been his mother-in-law, Caroline's gleeful cruelty, and the way she had orchestrated the entire scene for her own entertainment. Within a single week, the narrative had shifted completely against the Hartwell family. Local society pages ran blind items that everyone could decode. Which pharmaceutical family's wedding fell apart after the groom's family treated the bride's mother like the hired help? Sources say the scene at the rehearsal dinner was so shocking that multiple guests left early. Former business partners of Williams began quietly distancing themselves from any association with the Hartwell name. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving at the estate. Phone calls went unreturned. The Hartwell name, once a social asset that opened doors throughout Cincinnati's elite circles, was rapidly becoming a liability that people wanted to avoid. Caroline was reportedly devastated by the sudden shift in her social standing. The woman who had spent decades cultivating her position as a pillar of Cincinnati society found herself increasingly isolated. "This is your fault," she reportedly screamed at Richard during a family dinner that one of the household staff later described to investigators. "You should have controlled her better. You should have made sure she understood her place. You let her walk away, and now everyone is talking about us like we're criminals." Richard tried calling me 17 times in the days following the canceled wedding. I watched his name appear on my phone screen again and again, each call a reminder of the man I had almost married. I did not answer a single one. His text messages ranged from apologetic to desperate to threatening as the days passed without response. Sarah, let's talk about this. I know things got out of hand, but we can work through it. Then, this has gone too far. You need to call me back. We have things to discuss. Then, my mother didn't mean anything by it. You're overreacting to a simple misunderstanding. Finally, if you don't call me back, you'll regret it. You have no idea what my family is capable of. I blocked his number without hesitation. The Hartwells still had no idea what was actually coming for them. They believed this was merely a social embarrassment, an uncomfortable chapter that would eventually blow over once the gossip moved on to fresher scandals. They had no idea that while they worried about dinner party invitations, they were being systematically dismantled by the woman they had dismissed as worthless. 3 months after the cancelled wedding, Hartwell Pharmaceutical Distribution was required to hold its annual shareholders meeting, a routine event that William had controlled without challenge for decades. A few aging board members who always voted with management. Some minor institutional investors who never asked difficult questions. Nothing that had ever threatened his absolute authority over the company he considered his personal property. Then he saw the agenda that had been filed for the meeting, and his confidence evaporated. An emergency motion had been submitted by an entity called Mitchell Capital Partners, a company no one in the boardroom had ever heard of, demanding an independent audit of corporate finances and calling for a vote of no confidence in current leadership. The filing revealed that Mitchell Capital Partners now controlled 34% of the company's voting shares, making it the single largest shareholder in Hartwell Pharmaceutical Distribution. William was stunned, his face draining of color as he read the documents. Who the hell is Mitchell Capital Partners? How did they acquire this much stock without anyone noticing? No one in the room could answer his questions. The board members looked at each other in confusion. The company's legal counsel shuffled papers nervously. The boardroom doors opened before anyone could formulate a response. And my mother walked in. Not the Eleanor Mitchell they remembered from the rehearsal dinner, the humble woman in the homemade dress who had been handed a champagne tray like a servant and called trash by Bradley. This Eleanor Mitchell wore a Chanel suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. Her silver hair was professionally styled. Her posture was straight and confident. She walked with the absolute certainty of someone who knew exactly how much power she held and exactly how she intended to use it. She was flanked by 2 attorneys in expensive suits and a forensic accountant carrying boxes of evidence. Behind her, I entered the room because I wanted to watch. I needed to see their faces when they understood what was happening. William's expression went from confusion to recognition to horror in approximately 3 seconds as he processed who had just walked into his boardroom. The woman he had dismissed as beneath his notice, the mother of the bride he had allowed his family to humiliate publicly. The person he had never bothered to investigate or understand. You, he breathed, the single word carrying all of his shock and dawning comprehension. Me, Mom said simply, taking a seat at the head of the conference table as if she owned the room, which, effectively, she now did. Let's begin. We have a great deal to discuss and very little time for the games your family seems to enjoy playing. What followed was a masterclass in corporate destruction. Mom's team presented the evidence methodically, each piece building upon the last to create an irrefutable picture of systematic fraud. Years of stolen funds traced through shell companies to William's personal accounts. Fake employees receiving salaries that went directly to the Hartwell family. Personal expenses totaling millions of dollars charged to the corporation without any legitimate business purpose. Real estate purchases, vacation properties, luxury vehicles, jewelry for Caroline, all paid for by shareholders who had no idea their money was being stolen. The documents were displayed on screens around the boardroom, each revelation more damaging than the last. The board members who had spent years rubber-stamping William's decisions began shifting in their seats, calculating how much personal liability they might face for failing to provide proper oversight. The institutional investors who had trusted the Hartwell name began furiously texting their legal teams. The walls closed in on William with every new piece of evidence presented. The board turned on him within the hour, self-preservation overriding years of loyalty. By the end of the day, William Hartwell had been removed as CEO of the company that bore his family name. Criminal referrals were sent to the SEC and the Department of Justice. The company's stock price dropped 40% in after-hours trading as news of the scandal began to leak. Caroline, watching from the gallery where family members were permitted to observe, had to be escorted out by security after screaming that this was all a conspiracy by jealous poor people who could not accept their betters. Richard just sat there through the entire proceeding, pale and silent, watching his family's empire crumble around him. The inheritance he had expected, the position he had assumed, would always be waiting, the wealth that had defined his identity. All of it disappeared in a single afternoon. He never once looked in my direction, perhaps unable to face the woman he had laughed at while his brother called her mother trash. As we left the building, Mom's legal team already making calls to coordinate with federal investigators, I asked her how she felt about what had just happened. She thought for a long moment before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Tired," she finally said. "Justice is exhausting. It requires patience and planning and resources that most people do not have access to. It demands that you stay focused on what matters when every instinct tells you to lash out impulsively. But justice is also necessary. People like the Hartwells go through their entire lives believing that their money makes them untouchable, that they can treat others however they want without consequences. Someone has to teach them otherwise." The shareholders' meeting was just the beginning of the Hartwells' reckoning. What happened to them over the next year would become a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and country clubs across the country, a warning to everyone who believes that wealth automatically makes them better than others. And my mother was not finished yet. If you're still watching and haven't subscribed to this channel, you're missing stories exactly like this one. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the conclusion of what happened to the Hartwell family is something you absolutely cannot miss, and neither is what my mother did with her billion-dollar fortune after justice was finally served. The Hartwell family's destruction was swift and thorough, like watching a building implode in slow motion, each support beam failing until the entire structure collapsed into rubble. William was indicted on 17 counts of securities fraud and embezzlement 6 months after that devastating shareholders' meeting. The federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using the evidence my mother's team had compiled over months of careful investigation. His attorneys advised him to plead guilty to avoid the spectacle of a trial that would only expose more damaging details about his decades of theft. He accepted a plea bargain and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, a minimum security facility in West Virginia, where he would spend his 70s surrounded by other white-collar criminals who had believed themselves too wealthy to face consequences. The man who had once looked at my mother like she was something unpleasant he had stepped in would now wear a prison uniform and eat meals from a tray in a cafeteria where everyone was exactly equal. Caroline fled Cincinnati within weeks of William's indictment, unable to face the complete social devastation that had befallen her carefully constructed world. She moved in with her sister in Arizona, a woman she had barely spoken to in years because she considered Phoenix society beneath her Cincinnati circles. The woman who had mocked my mother's department store dress and orchestrated her humiliation at the rehearsal dinner would spend her remaining years in a modest 2-bedroom condominium, pretending to new acquaintances that she had never lived in Ohio, never been married to William Hartwell, never been the queen of a social kingdom that no longer existed. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had sold the last of her real jewelry to pay for living expenses, keeping only the paste replicas that she wore to maintain the illusion that she still had wealth worth displaying. Bradley, the one who had stood in front of 200 people and called my mother trash, discovered what life was like without a trust fund when the federal government froze all Hartwell family assets during the criminal proceedings. For the first time in his 28 years of existence, he had to find actual employment to pay for food and shelter. The last reliable information I received indicated he was selling used cars at a dealership in Kentucky. Though knowing Bradley's tendency toward exaggeration, even that modest position might have been inflated for the sake of his bruised ego. The man who had never worked a day in his life, who had mocked my mother for serving food at a diner, was now dependent on commission from convincing people to buy pre-owned sedans with questionable histories. And Richard? Richard tried desperately to salvage something from the wreckage of his family's empire. He reached out to me repeatedly in the months following the shareholders' meeting, his messages cycling through every possible emotional appeal. He apologized for his behavior at the rehearsal dinner, claiming he had been caught off guard and had reacted poorly. He explained that his family had pressured him, that he had never personally believed the cruel things they said about my mother. He begged for another chance, insisting that he had always genuinely loved me and that we could start over somewhere new, away from Cincinnati and the shadow of his family's disgrace. He claimed he was different from them, that he had never agreed with their attitudes, that he had been planning to stand up to them after we were married. Every message was more desperate than the last, more transparent in its attempt to rewrite history and cast himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a willing participant in his family's cruelty. I never responded to a single message. Some bridges do not deserve to be rebuilt, and some people do not deserve second chances. Richard had shown me exactly who he was when he laughed at my mother's humiliation. No amount of apologizing could erase that moment of revealed character. The Hartwell estate was sold at auction to pay legal fees and restitution to the shareholders William had defrauded. The 40-acre property that had once hosted governors and senators was purchased by a developer who planned to subdivide it into a suburban housing development. The yacht was repossessed by the leasing company after payments stopped arriving. The country club memberships lapsed when the fees went unpaid, and the board voted to permanently ban the Hartwell name from reapplication. The art collection, the wine cellar, the luxury vehicles, everything was liquidated to pay for William's defense and the civil lawsuits that followed his criminal conviction. Within 18 months of my canceled wedding, the Hartwell name had gone from Cincinnati royalty to cautionary tale, whispered about at the very events they had once dominated. The higher they climb, Mom said one evening as we sat on her porch in Millbrook, watching fireflies dance in the summer twilight, the more spectacular the fall when the foundation gives way. But she did not say it with satisfaction or vindictive pleasure. She said it with a sadness that surprised me, given everything the Hartwells had put her through. "I take no joy in their suffering," she told me, her voice quiet and thoughtful. "Destroying them was never the goal, Sarah. I just needed them to understand that kindness isn't weakness, that humility isn't inferiority, that the people they dismiss as beneath them might be their equals or more. They needed to learn that their money and their name did not give them the right to treat other human beings as entertainment for their cruelty. Sometimes the only way to teach that lesson is to take away the very thing they believe makes them superior." In the 2 years since the canceled wedding, my life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined when I was planning centerpieces and arguing about seating charts. Not just because of the money, though, yes, I have allowed Mom to share some of her fortune with me now that the secret is revealed. We traveled together for the first time in our lives, visiting places we had only seen in magazines. Paris, where we stood beneath the Eiffel Tower and laughed about how we used to dream of seeing it someday. London, where we had afternoon tea at the Savoy, and Mom observed that their scones were not nearly as good as the ones at the Bluebird Diner. A small villa in Tuscany, where we spent a month drinking wine and talking about everything and nothing, making up for all the conversations we might have had if we had not been so focused on survival. But the money has been less important than the freedom it has provided, the freedom to choose how we spend our time, to pursue work that matters rather than work that merely pays the bills, to help others the way we wished someone had helped us during our hardest years. We established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, kids like I was, who needed someone to believe in their potential and provide the resources to achieve it. Last year alone, we funded 47 full rides to universities across the country. Each recipient reminds me of myself at 18, desperate for an education but terrified of the debt required to obtain it. I left hospital administration, walking away from a career I had built over 20 years but never truly loved. Instead, I started consulting for healthcare nonprofits, organizations that provide medical services to people who cannot afford them, groups that actually make a difference in their communities rather than just generating profits for shareholders. The work matters in a way that my previous job never did, and I wake up each morning knowing that what I do that day will genuinely help someone who needs it. And Mom, at 70 years old, she finally stopped hiding who she really was. She donated $50 million to the Millbrook, Indiana School District, The same schools that had educated both of us with limited resources and dedicated teachers. They named the new library after her, though she tried to convince them to name it after my grandmother instead. She endowed a women's entrepreneurship program at the state university, providing seed funding for female-owned businesses that banks would not take chances on. She gave $20 million to medical research, specifically targeting diseases that primarily affect people in poverty. She quietly funded 24 small businesses owned by people who reminded her of Harold Weston, brilliant dreamers with revolutionary ideas who just needed capital and someone to believe in them. "I spent 35 years building this fortune," she told me during one of our late-night conversations at her kitchen table, the same table where she had balanced all those ledgers decades ago. "Now I get to spend whatever time I have left, giving it away to people who will use it to build something better." That's the real value of wealth, not what you can buy for yourself, but what you can make possible for others. Despite having access to billions of dollars, she still lives in the same small house in Millbrook where I grew up. She still tends her garden every morning, growing tomatoes and green beans and flowers that she gives away to neighbors. She still drinks tea at midnight when she cannot sleep, still sits at that kitchen table with a pencil and paper, though now she is calculating how much she can donate rather than how much she needs to earn. Some things are simply too precious to change, too fundamental to who we are, to be altered by something as superficial as money. People ask me if I regret calling off the wedding. If I ever wonder what life would have been like as Mrs. Richard Hartwell, living in that 40-acre estate, attending those country club luncheons, wearing diamonds that cost more than most people's houses. The answer is simple and absolute. Never. Not once. Not for a single second in the 2 years since I walked out of the Pemberton holding my mother's hand. Here's what that night taught me. Lessons that have become the foundation of everything I've built since. First, the people who try to make you feel small are telling you everything you need to know about themselves. Their cruelty is a confession. Their mockery is a mirror. Hurt people, and insecure people belittle others because it's the only way they know to feel tall. The Hartwells' cruelty toward my mother wasn't about her at all. It was about their own emptiness, their desperate need to feel superior to someone, anyone, because deep down they suspected they were superior to no one. When Caroline forced that champagne tray into my mother's hands, she was revealing her own fear that without her husband's money, she would be the one serving drinks. Second, money doesn't make you better than anyone. It just makes you richer. The wealthiest people I have known are often the most broken, hiding behind their bank accounts because they have nothing else to offer the world. And the poorest people, like the mother I thought I knew for 51 years, are often the richest in everything that actually matters. Character, integrity, the ability to sacrifice for someone you love, the strength to endure humiliation with dignity, the wisdom to know that your worth has nothing to do with your net worth. My mother could have revealed her billions at any moment during those 8 months of wedding planning. She could have shut down Caroline's condescension with a single bank statement. She chose not to because she understood that proving yourself to people who don't respect you is a game where everyone loses. Third, choose someone who respects your parents. This isn't about whether your partner likes your family or gets along with them perfectly. It's about basic human respect for the people who raised you, who sacrificed for you, who loved you before anyone else did. Because how they treat the people who brought you into this world is exactly how they'll eventually treat you when the honeymoon phase ends and real life begins. Richard's willingness to laugh at my mother's humiliation was a preview of every argument we would ever have. Every time he would choose his family over mine, every moment he would prioritize appearances over my feelings. A person who can watch your parent be hurt and find it amusing is a person who will someday find your own pain entertaining. Fourth, patience isn't weakness, it's the ultimate form of strength. My mother waited 35 years. She could have revealed her wealth the moment she earned it. She could have moved us to a mansion, enrolled me in private school, surrounded us with luxury that would have changed everything about our lives. Instead, she let me struggle and grow and build my own life through my own efforts. She waited for exactly the right moment to act, not from impulse or anger, but from strategic calculation. That's not passive. That's not weak. That's the kind of discipline that builds empires and destroys them with equal precision. The Hartwells thought my mother's silence was submission. They learned too late that it was preparation. And finally, the most important lesson. The best revenge isn't destruction, it's construction. It's building a life so full of meaning, so rich in genuine love and authentic purpose, that the people who tried to hurt you become nothing more than footnotes in a story they can no longer influence. I don't think about the Hartwells anymore, not with anger or satisfaction or any emotion at all, really. They've become exactly what they feared most throughout their entire lives: irrelevant. Their money is gone. Their reputation is destroyed. Their name is a cautionary tale. But more than that, they simply don't matter to anyone anymore. They're not even interesting enough to hate. They're just a reminder of what happens when you mistake cruelty for strength and wealth for worth. Yesterday, I asked Mom what she wanted people to take from our story as we sat on her porch in Millbrook, the same porch where she used to sit after working 3 jobs, counting pennies to make sure we could afford groceries that week. She thought for a long moment, her 70-year-old hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes focused on something beyond the garden she still tends every morning. Then she said, "Everyone has a story, Sarah. Every single person you meet has been through something that would break your heart if you knew about it. The person serving your coffee at the diner might be a secret genius who never got their chance. The woman cleaning your office might be raising the next president on a minimum wage salary. The quiet man in the worn shoes, standing at the bus stop, might have more wisdom in his little finger than all the boardrooms and country clubs in the world combined." She squeezed my hand with that familiar warmth I've known my entire life, the touch that always made everything better when I was young and scared and uncertain about my place in the world. Never assume you know someone's worth just by looking at them or checking their bank balance or evaluating their clothes. Never dismiss someone as beneath you because they work with their hands or speak with an accent or shop at discount stores. Because the moment you treat another human being as less than yourself, you've revealed exactly who you really are. You've shown the world that your character is as empty as your soul, that your confidence is so fragile it requires you to stand on others, to feel tall, and you've probably made a very expensive mistake that will cost you far more than money." She smiled then, that gentle smile that hides steel beneath silk. The Hartwells learned that lesson the hard way. They're not the first, and they won't be the last. But maybe someone watching will remember this story the next time they're tempted to judge someone by their appearance rather than their character. If this story reminded you of someone in your life who deserves more respect than they receive, share it with them. Let them know that someone sees their worth beyond their circumstances, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up for someone you love against people who didn't understand their worth? Have you ever discovered that someone you underestimated was far more than they appeared? Have you learned that true wealth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the people who stand beside you when the rest of the world walks away? We read every single comment because every story matters, just like every person matters, regardless of what they have in their bank account, or what designer label they wear, or what neighborhood they call home. Until next time, remember that the quiet ones often have the loudest impact, and the humble ones often have the most to be proud of. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person you dismiss as trash is actually a billionaire who's about to teach you exactly how wrong you were.